The year was 1900, and the American West was slowly surrendering its wildness to the march of civilization. In the remote town of Brimstone Valley, Arizona Territory, the railroad had brought prosperity to some and misery to many. Hidden beneath the veneer of progress lay a darkness that would shock even the most hardened frontier souls, a trade in human lives that preyed upon society's most vulnerable. This is the story of corrupt power, innocent suffering, and one woman's crusade to bring justice to a lawless land where children were bought and sold like cattle, until Judge Clara Thornton rode into town to end the cruelty forever. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The morning sun cast long shadows across Brimstone Valley's main street as the weekly orphan auction prepared to begin. What the town euphemistically called child placement proceedings was in reality a grotesque marketplace where human lives were bartered for coin. Judge Amos Conroy adjusted his black robes and surveyed the crowd gathered outside the courthouse with the satisfaction of a man who had turned misery into profit. At 55, Conroy was a mountain of a man whose imposing presence had intimidated countless souls over his 15-year reign as territorial judge. His partner in corruption, Judge Silas McVeigh, stood beside him, a thin, weasel-faced man whose cruel eyes missed nothing and whose ledger books tracked every sordid transaction. Fine morning for business, wouldn't you say, Silas? Conroy rumbled, his voice carrying the false joviality of a carnival barker. Indeed, Amos. I count at least a dozen potential buyers, and we have 18 children available for placement today. McVeigh's voice was as thin and sharp as his appearance, each word calculated for maximum efficiency. In the courthouse basement, 18 children between the ages of 6 and 16 sat in wooden cages, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of those who had learned that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Among them was 10-year-old Billy Henderson, whose parents had died in a mine collapse 6 months earlier. His sister Sarah, only 8 years old, clutched a worn rag doll, the only remnant of their former life. "Billy," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of boots on the floorboards above. "When will someone nice come for us?" Billy looked at his little sister, his heart breaking at the trust still shining in her brown eyes. He'd seen what happened to the children who were placed by the judges. They disappeared into the desert, sent to work the copper mines or cattle ranches, where children labored until they died or grew strong enough to escape. Those who tried to run were usually brought back by bounty hunters who worked for the judges. "Soon, Sarah," he lied, pulling her close. "Someone nice will come for us soon." Above them, the auction was beginning. Ranch owner Jeremiah Blackwood examined the list of available children with the cold calculation of a man buying livestock. His mines needed small hands to crawl through narrow passages, and children were cheaper than adult workers. Plus, they were less likely to organize labor strikes. "I'll take the Henderson boy," Blackwood announced, slapping $20 on Judge Conroy's desk. "He looks strong enough for the copper works." "An excellent choice, Mr. Blackwood," Conroy replied, making a note in the ledger. "Young Billy has good bloodlines. His father was a hard worker before that unfortunate accident." "What about the girl?" asked Martha Grimsby, the wife of a cattle baron whose ranch stretched for thousands of acres. "She looks suitable for housework." Judge McVeigh smiled his reptilian smile. "Young Sarah is indeed available for domestic placement. She's well-trained in cooking and cleaning, very obedient. $15. As the bidding continued, Dr. Edmund Walsh stood in the back of the crowd, his medical bag clutched tightly in his weathered hands. At 62, he had seen enough frontier brutality to last several lifetimes, but the sight of children being sold like merchandise made his stomach turn. He treated too many of these placed children. Those who survived long enough to need medical attention bore scars that told stories of unimaginable cruelty. "This is madness," he muttered to Father Miguel Santos, the elderly priest who served Brimstone Valley's small Catholic community. "Those children aren't orphans being placed in loving homes. They're slaves being sold to the highest bidder." Father Santos nodded grimly, his lined face creased with sorrow. "I've tried to intervene, Edmund, but the judges have threatened to revoke my license to perform marriages and baptisms. Without that authority, I cannot serve my congregation." "Then we need someone with authority greater than theirs," Dr. Walsh replied. "Someone who can't be intimidated or bought." Both men knew such a person was unlikely to exist in Brimstone Valley. Judge Conroy and Judge McVeigh had spent years building a network of corruption that extended from the local sheriff all the way to the territorial governor. Anyone who challenged their authority found themselves facing trumped-up charges or, in some cases, simply disappeared into the desert. As the auction concluded and the children were led away to their new placements, neither the doctor nor the priest could have imagined that salvation was already riding toward Brimstone Valley in the form of a determined woman carrying a federal judicial appointment and an unshakable belief in justice. Meanwhile, in the courthouse basement, Billy Henderson was separated from his sister for what he feared might be the last time. As rough hands dragged him toward a waiting wagon, he heard Sarah screaming his name, her voice cutting through the afternoon air like a knife through his heart. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he shouted back, struggling against his captors. "I'll find you. I promise I'll find you." But even as he made the promise, Billy wondered if he would live long enough to keep it. The copper mines were known to be death traps, and children rarely survived more than a year in their toxic depths. Judge Conroy watched the departing wagons with satisfaction, already counting the day's profits. He had no way of knowing that his lucrative empire of misery was about to face its greatest threat, a woman who believed that justice was not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a sacred trust to be protected at all costs. As the sun set over Brimstone Valley, painting the desert sky in shades of red and gold, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether corruption or righteousness would triumph in this forgotten corner of the American frontier. 3 days after the latest auction, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon as a lone rider approached Brimstone Valley. Judge Clara Thornton sat straight in her saddle, her keen gray eyes taking in every detail of the town that was about to become her new jurisdiction. At 34, she was young for a federal judge, but her reputation for integrity and legal brilliance had earned her the appointment to this remote territorial post. Clara had not come to Brimstone Valley by choice. Her previous position in Denver had ended abruptly when she'd exposed a conspiracy involving railroad barons and corrupt politicians. The powers that be had dealt with her troublesome honesty by exiling her to what they assumed was a harmless backwater posting. They had no idea they were sending a fox to guard the henhouse. As Clara rode down Main Street, she noticed several things that immediately raised her suspicions. The town showed signs of prosperity, new buildings, well-maintained streets, expensive carriages. Yet the few children she saw looked malnourished and wore the fearful expressions of the perpetually hunted. Adults averted their eyes as she passed, and an unnatural quiet hung over the community like a shroud. She reined in her horse outside the courthouse, the imposing stone building that dominated the town square. As she dismounted, Sheriff Dan Kroger emerged from his office, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Kroger was Judge Conroy's chief enforcer, a man whose loyalty had been purchased with a generous share of the auction profits. "Ma'am," Kroger said, touching the brim of his hat with mock courtesy, "I'm afraid the courthouse is closed to visitors today. Judges Conroy and McVeigh are conducting important business." Clara studied the sheriff's face, noting the nervous twitch in his left eye and the way his hand rested casually on his gun belt. "I'm not a visitor, Sheriff. I'm Judge Clara Thornton, and I'm here to assume my duties as federal territorial judge." The color drained from Kroger's face. "Federal judge? But we already have 2 judges here, and they've been doing a fine job for years." "I'm sure they have," Clara replied dryly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make the sheriff take a step backward. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to review the court records and case files." As Clara climbed the courthouse steps, Dr. Walsh emerged from the shadows where he'd been watching the exchange. "Begging your pardon, Judge Thornton, but might I have a word with you?" Clara paused, studying the elderly physician's earnest face. "Of course, Dr. Walsh. Dr. Edmund Walsh. I've been practicing medicine in this town for 12 years, and I've seen things that would turn your stomach. If you're truly here to administer justice, then you need to know what's been happening in Brimstone Valley." Over the next hour, Dr. Walsh and Father Santos briefed Clara on the horrors they had witnessed. They spoke of children sold into virtual slavery, of families torn apart for profit, and of a judicial system corrupted beyond recognition. Clara listened with growing outrage, her hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the corruption became clear. "You have documentation of these crimes?" she asked. Dr. Walsh nodded. "I've kept detailed medical records of every child I've treated. Most show signs of severe malnutrition, physical abuse, and psychological trauma. Father Santos has been maintaining his own records of families destroyed by the judge's actions. And the local authorities? Sheriff Kroger takes his orders directly from Judge Conroy." Father Santos replied. "Half the town council is in their pocket, and the other half is too terrified to speak out." Clara stood up, her decision made. "Gentlemen, I want you to gather every piece of evidence you have. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to pay a visit to Judges Conroy and McVeigh. It's time someone reminded them that federal law supersedes their territorial corruption." That evening, as Clara settled into her hotel room, she reviewed the territorial laws governing child welfare and judicial authority. What she found made her blood boil. The statutes clearly prohibited the sale of children under any circumstances, yet Conroy and McVeigh had been operating their auction system for years without interference. Meanwhile, in Judge Conroy's private office, an emergency meeting was taking place. Sheriff Kroger had delivered the unwelcome news of Clara's arrival, and the corrupt judges were scrambling to protect their lucrative operation. "We can't simply eliminate her," McVeigh said, pacing nervously behind his desk. "She's a federal appointee. Her disappearance would bring unwanted attention from Washington." Conroy leaned back in his chair, his massive frame making the furniture creak ominously. "Then we'll have to be more subtle. Discredit her, perhaps. A woman judge in the territories. There are plenty of men who would question her competence. And if that doesn't work, then we'll remind her that Brimstone Valley can be a very dangerous place for those who don't understand how things work here." Neither judge realized that their conversation was being overheard by young Tommy Martinez, a 12-year-old orphan who survived by hiding in the courthouse rafters and stealing scraps of food. Tommy had learned to be invisible, a skill that had kept him alive when so many other children had vanished into the judge's auction system. As the judges continued their plotting, Tommy slipped away into the night, carrying information that could change everything. He had a decision to make: remain hidden and safe, or risk everything to help the new judge, who might be their only hope for salvation. The battle lines were being drawn in Brimstone Valley, and tomorrow would bring the first confrontation between corruption and justice. Clara Thornton had no idea that she was walking into a war, but she was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with law books and unwavering moral courage. The next morning dawned clear and hot as Clara Thornton made her way to the courthouse, a leather satchel filled with federal statutes and territorial laws under her arm. She had spent the night reviewing every legal precedent that might help her dismantle the corruption in Brimstone Valley, and she was ready for battle. As she climbed the courthouse steps, she was surprised to find a small figure waiting in the shadows, a boy of perhaps 12, thin as a rail and wearing clothes that had seen better days. When he saw her approach, he stepped forward with the desperate courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Judge Thornton?" Tommy Martinez's voice was barely above a whisper. "I got information you need to know." Clara knelt down to the boy's level, her expression gentle but alert. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy Martinez. I live wherever I can hide. Been listening to the judges talk, and they're planning something bad for you." In hushed tones, Tommy relayed everything he had overheard the previous night. Clara listened with growing concern, not just for her own safety, but for this brave child who was risking everything to help her. "Tommy, do you know where the children from the auctions are taken?" The boy nodded vigorously. "Some go to the Blackwood copper mines about 20 miles north. Others get sent to the Grimsby Ranch. I seen the wagons leaving town. Them kids, they don't never come back. Would you be willing to testify about what you've seen and heard?" Tommy's eyes widened with fear, but after a moment he nodded. "If it means stopping them judges from hurting more kids, then yes, ma'am. I'll tell what I know." Clara placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. Then let's go introduce you to Dr. Walsh and Father Santos. You're going to need protection, and they're the only people in this town I trust completely." After ensuring Tommy's safety, Clara strode into the courthouse and demanded an immediate meeting with Judges Conroy and McVeigh. The two corrupt officials had prepared for this confrontation, surrounding themselves with several armed men, including Sheriff Kroger and a hired gun named Snake Morrison, whose reputation for violence was legendary throughout the territory. Judge Thornton, Conroy boomed with false cordiality as she entered his chambers. "What an unexpected pleasure. I trust you're finding our little town hospitable." "I've found it illuminating," Clara replied coldly, setting her satchel on Conroy's desk with a thud that made several of the men jump, "particularly your creative interpretation of territorial child welfare laws." McVeigh stepped forward, his thin face twisted into a sneer. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Judge Thornton. We simply provide placement services for orphan children, perfectly legal under Territorial Statute 47B. Clara opened her satchel and withdrew a thick volume of federal law. "Actually, what you're doing violates no fewer than 7 federal statutes governing child welfare, human trafficking, and judicial corruption. Would you like me to read them to you?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Clara began citing specific laws and penalties. She spoke with the precision of a surgeon and the authority of someone who had memorized every relevant statute. As she talked, the faces of the men around her grew increasingly pale. "Furthermore," Clara continued, "I have documented evidence of your activities, including medical records, witness testimonies, and financial transactions that clearly show you've been selling children for profit." Judge Conroy's facade of cordiality finally cracked. "Now see here, young woman. You may have some fancy federal appointment, but this is our jurisdiction. We've been maintaining order in this territory for 15 years, and we don't need some uppity Eastern lawyer telling us how to do our jobs." "Maintaining order?" Clara's voice rose with righteous indignation. "You call selling children into slavery maintaining order? You call destroying families for profit order? What you've created here is an order. It's a systematic program of child abuse sanctioned by corrupt officials who should be in prison." Sheriff Kroger stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Judge, maybe you should think real careful about what you're saying. This territory can be dangerous for folks who don't understand how things work." Clara turned to face the sheriff, her gray eyes blazing with fury. "Are you threatening a federal judge, Sheriff? Because if you are, I should inform you that the penalty for threatening a federal official is 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The standoff continued for several tense moments, with armed men on one side and a single woman armed only with law books on the other. Finally, Judge McVeigh broke the silence. "What exactly do you propose to do, Judge Thornton? You're one person against an entire system. Even if your accusations had merit, which they don't, you lack the authority to interfere with our territorial operations." Clara smiled grimly. "Actually, I have all the authority I need." She withdrew an official document from her satchel and placed it on the desk. "This is a federal warrant authorizing me to investigate reports of judicial corruption and child trafficking in this territory. It grants me the authority to suspend local officials, seize records, and place suspects under federal arrest." The document bore the official seal of the United States District Court and the signature of a federal district judge from Denver. Clara had obtained it before leaving Colorado, knowing that she might face exactly this kind of resistance. "You have 24 hours to produce every child currently under your placement program," Clara continued. "You will also provide complete financial records for the past 5 years. Failure to comply will result in federal charges for obstruction of justice." Judge Conroy's face had turned purple with rage. "You can't just waltz into our town and start making demands. We have rights." "So do the children you've been selling," Clara shot back. "And unlike you, they're innocent." As Clara gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Snake Morrison stepped into her path. The gunfighter was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a reputation for killing anyone who crossed his employers. "Lady," Morrison drawled, "you might want to consider riding out of town while you still can. Sometimes federal judges have accidents out here in the wilderness. Clara looked the hired killer straight in the eye, showing no trace of fear. Mr. Morrison, I assume that's your name? I want you to understand something very clearly. I didn't come to Brimstone Valley to play games or negotiate with criminals. I came here to enforce federal law. If any harm comes to me, Dr. Walsh, Father Santos, or that brave boy who's helping me expose your operation, federal marshals will descend on this town like the wrath of God. She stepped closer to Morrison, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouted threats. And when they're finished, there won't be enough left of your little criminal enterprise to bury in a matchbox. With that, Clara Thornton walked out of the courthouse, leaving behind a room full of desperate men who suddenly realized their comfortable world of corruption was about to come crashing down around them. The gauntlet had been thrown, and the real battle was about to begin. That evening, Clara Thornton sat in Dr. Walsh's office with her unlikely band of allies, the elderly physician, Father Santos, and young Tommy Martinez. Maps of the surrounding territory were spread across the doctor's desk, marked with the locations of mines and ranches where children had been taken. We need to move fast, Clara said, studying the documents Tommy had helped them compile. Conroy and McVeigh will try to hide the evidence and possibly eliminate witnesses. Our priority has to be getting those children to safety. Dr. Walsh pointed to a mark on the map. The Blackwood copper mines are here, about 20 miles north. It's heavily guarded, but I know a back way through the canyon that might give us access. And the Grimsby Ranch is 15 miles east, Father Santos added. I've been there before to perform last rites for workers who died in accidents. The conditions are brutal. Tommy looked up from the corner, where he'd been quietly listening. Judge, what about the other kids still in town? Conroy keeps some in the courthouse basement for the next auction. They ain't eaten in 2 days. Clara's face hardened with determination. Then we start there. Tonight. What Clara didn't know was that at that very moment, Judge Conroy was implementing his own desperate plan. He had sent word to Jeremiah Blackwood and Martha Grimsby, ordering them to eliminate the children already in their custody. Dead children couldn't testify about their treatment, and without living witnesses, Clara's case would collapse. Kill them all, Conroy had written in his coded message. Make it look like accidents. Mining cave-ins, ranch stampedes. Use your imagination. But Conroy had underestimated the power of desperate hope. At the Blackwood mines, 10-year-old Billy Henderson had been planning an escape for weeks. When word spread among the child workers that a federal judge was in town asking questions, Billy knew this might be their only chance. Listen to me, he whispered to the other children during their brief rest period. There's a judge in town who wants to help us, but we got to help ourselves first. Tonight, when the guards change shift, we make a run for it. 8-year-old Sarah Henderson, who had been placed at the Grimsby Ranch, was facing her own crisis. Martha Grimsby had decided that the girl knew too much about the ranch's treatment of child workers and planned to stage a riding accident the next morning. But Sarah had made an unlikely ally in Maria Gonzalez, a Mexican woman who worked in the ranch kitchen and had watched helplessly as children disappeared over the years. When Maria overheard Mrs. Grimsby's plans, she made a decision that would change everything. Nina, she whispered to Sarah during the evening meal, you must run tonight. Take this. She pressed a small knife and a bag of food into the girl's hands. Follow the North Star until you reach the town. Find the lady judge. She will protect you. Back in Brimstone Valley, Clara's rescue mission was about to begin. She had managed to convince Deputy Marshal Jake Thornton, no relation, despite the shared surname, to assist her. Jake had arrived in town that afternoon, responding to Clara's urgent telegram to the federal marshal's office in Tucson. You sure about this, Judge? Jake asked as they prepared to raid the courthouse basement. These men won't hesitate to shoot federal officers. Then we'd better not give them the chance, Clara replied, checking the Colt .45 she carried in a shoulder holster. Despite her legal background, Clara had grown up on a ranch and was as comfortable with firearms as she was with law books. At midnight, Clara and Deputy Marshal Thornton slipped into the courthouse through a basement window that Tommy had shown them. What they found in the basement cells would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 12 children, ranging in age from 6 to 15, were locked in wooden cages barely large enough for animals. They were malnourished, filthy, and clearly terrified. "It's all right," Clara whispered to the frightened children as Jake picked the locks on their cages. "We're here to help you. You're going to be safe now." But even as she spoke the words, Clara heard the sound of boots on the stairs above. Sheriff Kroger and 3 deputies were descending into the basement, their guns drawn. "Well, well," Kroger sneered. "Look what we got here. Federal officers breaking and entering." "These children are being held illegally," Clara replied, standing protectively in front of the youngsters. "I'm exercising my federal authority to place them in protective custody." "Your authority don't mean much when you're dead," one of the deputies snarled, raising his rifle. The basement erupted in gunfire as Deputy Marshal Thornton drew his weapon and returned fire. Clara pushed the children behind an overturned table and drew her own gun, proving that her marksmanship was as accurate as her legal reasoning. When the smoke cleared, Sheriff Kroger lay dead, and his deputies had fled. The children were safe, but Clara knew the real battle was just beginning. Over the next 6 hours, a series of dramatic rescues unfolded across the territory. Billy Henderson led his fellow mine workers in a successful escape from the Blackwood operation, while Sarah Henderson arrived in town just as the sun was rising, guided by Maria Gonzalez, who had decided to risk everything to save the children. By noon, Clara had assembled more than 30 children who had been victims of the judge's auction system. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic abuse that made even hardened lawmen weep with rage. Judge Conroy and Judge McVeigh made one last desperate attempt to flee, but they were captured by Deputy Marshal Thornton at the edge of town. When federal marshals arrived from Tucson the next day, they found a mountain of evidence documenting years of corruption, child trafficking, and judicial malfeasance. The trials that followed made national headlines. Judge Amos Conroy and Judge Silas McVeigh were convicted on federal charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. Jeremiah Blackwood and Martha Grimsby received 20-year sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. Sheriff Kroger's death was ruled justifiable homicide in the line of duty. But for Clara Thornton, the real victory came in the weeks that followed, as she worked to reunite families and find loving homes for the children who had been orphaned by tragedy rather than greed. Tommy Martinez became her unofficial assistant, using his knowledge of the streets to help locate missing siblings and relatives. Billy and Sarah Henderson were reunited in a tearful ceremony that left not a dry eye in the courthouse. Dr. Walsh and Father Santos worked tirelessly to provide medical care and emotional support for the traumatized children, while Maria Gonzalez opened her home to several youngsters who needed a safe place to heal. On a warm autumn evening, as Clara sat on the courthouse steps watching children play in the town square, children who were now free to laugh and run without fear, Tommy Martinez approached her with a serious expression. "Judge," he said, "I've been thinking. What's to stop more bad men from coming here and starting this whole thing over again?" Clara smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "That's why we're going to make sure it never happens again, Tommy. We're going to build a system here that protects children instead of exploiting them. And we're going to teach people that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with guns. They're fought with laws and the courage to enforce them." As the sun set over Brimstone Valley, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Clara reflected on the transformation she had witnessed. The town that had once been a marketplace for human misery was becoming a beacon of justice and hope. The auction block where children had been sold like livestock was torn down and replaced with a playground. The courthouse basement was converted into a library where those same children could now learn to read and write, preparing for futures filled with possibility rather than despair. And in the federal courthouse that Clara now presided over with fairness and integrity, a new motto was carved into the stone above the entrance: "Justice for all, especially the innocent." The cruelty had ended forever, and in its place, hope had taken root and begun to flourish in the desert soil of the American frontier. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.